My name is Chloe Parker, and I was 28 years old when this happened. I remember standing in my apartment 3 days before the flight, surrounded by boxes I'd labeled in careful handwriting: kitchen essentials, winter clothes, books I couldn't part with. I wasn't moving permanently, just 6 months for a work assignment overseas, but I packed like someone who wanted to make sure everything would be exactly where I left it when I came back. My family had offered to check on the place while I was gone. My mother said she'd water the plants. My sister promised to forward any mail that looked important. My brother joked that he'd keep the dust from settling. It felt like the kind of thing families did for each other. Not a favor exactly, just what you do. I trusted them, not in some blind, idealistic way. I knew we weren't perfect. We had our arguments, our silences, our old resentments that never quite disappeared, but we were functional. We showed up for birthdays, we helped each other move furniture, we didn't steal from each other. At least, I didn't think we did. The day I left, I handed my sister a spare key and went over everything one more time. She nodded through it all, half listening, the way people do when they've heard instructions twice already. I didn't push. I didn't want to seem like I didn't trust her. I locked the door behind me and stood there for a second, looking back at the place I'd lived in for 3 years. It felt strange to leave it in someone else's hands, even people I'd known my entire life. But I told myself that was just nerves. At the airport, I texted my mother a photo of my boarding pass. She sent back a thumbs up emoji and told me to be safe. I boarded the plane feeling excited, a little anxious, and sure, completely sure that everything I cared about would still be there when I got back. The first month went smoothly. My mother sent updates about the plants. My sister texted photos of the living room, everything exactly where I'd left it. I felt ridiculous for ever worrying. But somewhere around week 5, the messages started changing. My sister stopped sending pictures. When I asked how things looked, she'd reply with something short: "All good," or "No problems." My mother's texts became slower, vaguer. I'd ask if she'd checked the mailbox, and she'd say she thought my brother had done it. My brother would say he thought my sister had. I tried calling. My mother didn't pick up the first time, then called back hours later saying she'd been busy. My sister answered once, sounded distracted, said everything was fine and that she had to go. My brother never answered at all. It wasn't anything I could point to and say, this is wrong. It was just absence, a thinning, like they were all slowly stepping back from something they'd promised to handle. I told myself I was overreacting. I was thousands of miles away, exhausted from work, probably reading too much into normal behavior. People get busy. People forget to text back. It didn't mean anything. But the feeling didn't leave. I started drafting messages asking directly, "Is something going on?" Then deleting them before I hit send. I didn't want to seem paranoid. I didn't want to accuse them of something I couldn't even name. So I let it go. I focused on work, on the project I'd flown halfway around the world to finish. I convinced myself that when I got home, everything would make sense. I just had to trust them a little longer. There were so many moments I could have asked. I remember one call with my mother where I mentioned wanting to see a photo of the apartment just to feel connected to home. She laughed and said, "It looks the same as it always does, honey. You worry too much." Then she changed the subject to something about her neighbor's dog. I didn't push. Another time, I asked my sister if she'd grabbed the package I was expecting. She paused just half a second too long and said she hadn't seen anything. When I asked if she'd checked recently, she said she'd been meaning to but kept forgetting. Then she said she had to run. I didn't push then either. I kept telling myself that distance was making me paranoid, that I was interpreting normal family chaos as something darker, that they deserved the benefit of the doubt because they were family, and family didn't lie to you about something this simple. But there was a voice underneath all that reasoning, quiet, persistent. It whispered that something was wrong, that the evasion wasn't accidental, that I wasn't imagining the pattern. I ignored it. I'd been trained my whole life to ignore it, to not make waves, to not assume the worst, to give people grace even when grace felt like self-betrayal. So I drafted one last message. Casual, light. "Hey, just checking in. Everything's still good with the apartment?" My sister replied 3 hours later. "Yeah, all good." 2 words. No photo, no detail, just enough to technically answer without actually saying anything. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I put my phone down and went back to work. I told myself I'd deal with it when I got home. I told myself I was overthinking. I told myself a lot of things that turned out to be lies. I landed on a Tuesday morning, jet-lagged and exhausted, but relieved to finally be home. The building looked the same, the hallway smelled the same. I unlocked my door expecting the familiar weight of walking into a space that belonged to me. Instead, I felt cold air and absence. The living room was wrong immediately. Not messy, not rearranged, empty. My couch was gone, the coffee table I'd found at an estate sale gone, the bookshelf my father had built for me years ago before he passed gone. I stood in the doorway, keys still in my hand, trying to make sense of the blank space where my life used to be. I walked through the apartment like I was touring a stranger's home. The TV was missing, the desk I'd worked at for 3 years, gone. My grandmother's armchair, the one I'd reupholstered myself, gone. In the bedroom, my dresser was missing, the nightstands, the lamp I'd bought on my first paycheck. I opened the closet. Half my clothes were gone. Not stolen in some chaotic burglary, carefully removed, selectively taken. The shock wasn't loud. It was cold, hollow, disorienting, like standing in a room where gravity worked differently. I called my sister first. She didn't answer. I called my mother. She picked up on the 4th ring, her voice cautious. "Hey, sweetie, you're back? Where's my stuff?" Silence. Then, "What do you mean? My furniture, my things, where are they?" Another pause. "Oh, we were going to talk to you about that." My brother joined the call, then my sister. The story came out in pieces, interruptions, overlapping justifications. They'd sold some things, just a few things, to help with bills. My mother's car had needed repairs, my sister's rent was late, my brother had medical expenses. "You weren't using them," my mother said. "We thought you wouldn't mind," my sister added. "We were struggling," my brother said, like that explained everything. I stood in the middle of my gutted apartment, phone pressed to my ear, listening to them reframe theft as generosity, as if they'd done me a favor by dismantling my life while I was gone. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I just stood there, surrounded by empty space, and realized how little I'd ever actually mattered to them. The conversations that followed were worse than the empty apartment. My mother called back that night, her tone shifting from defensive to soothing. "I know you're upset, but you're overreacting. It was just furniture. We can help you get new things." Just furniture? As if my grandmother's chair was interchangeable with something from a clearance aisle? My brother texted the next morning, "You're being dramatic over stuff. We had real problems. You were gone anyway." My sister showed up at my door 2 days later with coffee and an explanation that sounded rehearsed. "Honestly, we thought we were doing you a favor. You had so much clutter. We helped you start fresh." I listened to each of them rewrite what happened. Theft became help, betrayal became love, my anger became evidence that I was selfish, materialistic, ungrateful. They didn't deny taking my things, they just refused to call it what it was. And the worst part, the part that made my chest feel tight and my thoughts loop endlessly, was that I started questioning myself. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe possessions didn't matter as much as I thought. Maybe I was being unreasonable for caring about objects when they'd had bills to pay. Maybe I was selfish for not immediately forgiving them. I could feel myself shrinking under the weight of their words, the way I always had, apologizing for feelings I had every right to feel, doubting my own reality because they spoke with such confidence. But somewhere underneath the doubt, something else was building. I stopped arguing with them. I stopped trying to explain why my grandmother's chair mattered, why my father's bookshelf wasn't replaceable, why the lamp from my first paycheck meant something they couldn't price at a yard sale. I just went quiet. They mistook my silence for acceptance. My mother said she was glad I was calming down. My brother said he knew I'd come around. My sister hugged me and said, "See, it's not that big of a deal." I didn't correct them. Because I'd realized something they hadn't. No amount of explaining would make them understand. No amount of hurt would make them admit what they'd done. So I stopped trying to make them see. And I started planning. The shift didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a moment of rage or revelation. It was quieter than that. I stopped responding to their texts with explanations. I stopped defending my feelings. I stopped trying to make them see what they'd done because I finally understood something I should have known years ago. They didn't want to see, so I let them think they'd won. I started sleeping better, not because I'd forgiven them, but because I'd stopped carrying the weight of trying to fix something they had no intention of acknowledging. Instead, I started researching. I pulled up old photos of my apartment, the ones I'd taken for insurance purposes years ago. I found receipts. I documented everything I could remember that had been taken: the couch I'd saved for, the desk I'd assembled myself, my grandmother's chair, my father's bookshelf, the lamp, the TV, the dresser. I made calls, quiet ones. I spoke to a lawyer about small claims. I asked about asset recovery, about documentation, about what I could prove and what I couldn't. I learned the language of legal boundaries and leverage. I didn't tell my family any of this. When my mother called to ask how I was settling back in, I said, "Fine, just busy with work." When my sister invited me to dinner, I said, "I can't this week, but maybe soon." When my brother asked if I was still mad, I said, "I'm over it." They believed me, because people who gaslight you always believe their own version of reality more than they believe your silence. I became calm, polite, distant in a way they couldn't quite name but didn't question. They thought I'd moved on. They thought I'd accepted their version of events. They thought my quietness meant peace. It didn't. It meant I knew something they didn't. There's a strange kind of power in that, in holding information close, in watching people relax because they think you've surrendered. They stopped being careful. They stopped watching their words. They went back to normal, assuming I had too. I hadn't. 2 months after I returned, I told them I was traveling again, just a short trip this time, 2 weeks, work-related. My mother said, "Already? You just got back." I said, "I know, but it's important." She didn't ask questions. None of them did. I booked the flight, I made the final arrangements, I scheduled everything down to the day, the hour, and then I left. The truck would arrive the day after. I packed light. One suitcase, a carry-on. Nothing that suggested I was running or hiding, just someone taking a quick work trip, the kind I'd done before. My family barely reacted when I told them. My mother said to be safe. My sister asked if I needed anyone to check on my apartment. I said no, I'd handled it. My brother didn't respond at all. They thought I'd moved on. They thought the silence meant forgiveness. They were wrong. I'd spent 2 months making calls, filing paperwork, gathering documentation. I'd worked with a lawyer who specialized in asset recovery and small claims. I'd provided photos, receipts, timestamps. I'd proven ownership of everything they'd sold. And I'd learned something useful. When you sell someone else's property without permission, there are legal consequences. The process was slow, procedural, boring in the way legal things always are, but it was also thorough, binding, enforceable. I scheduled everything for the day after I left. The flight was early. I texted my family from the airport, "Boarding now, talk soon," and turned off my notifications. 24 hours later, the truck arrived. Not at my apartment, at theirs. I was sitting in a cafe halfway around the world when my phone started lighting up. I'd turned notifications back on by then, curious to see how long it would take. It didn't take long. My sister called first. I didn't answer. She called again. Then my brother, then my mother, then all three of them in a group chat that exploded with messages faster than I could read them. "What is this? There are people at my house. They have paperwork. They're taking my stuff. Chloe Parker, what did you do?" I sipped my coffee and scrolled through the messages slowly, deliberately. My mother's texts were frantic. She said there were movers outside her house with a court order. She said they were removing furniture, electronics, things she'd bought with the money from selling mine. She said this had to be a mistake. It wasn't. My brother called it illegal. My sister called it insane. My mother called it cruel. None of them called it what it actually was: consequence. I didn't respond right away. I let the messages pile up, let the panic build, let them feel what I felt walking into my empty apartment. The shock, the confusion, the helplessness of watching your life be dismantled by people you trusted. Finally, hours later, I typed a single message. "You sold my things while I was gone. I didn't know you'd struggle to replace them." I hit send. Then I put my phone on silent, ordered another coffee, and opened my book. I felt nothing but calm. They'd taken from me in secret, in silence, while I was thousands of miles away. Now something had come for them in broad daylight, and I wasn't there to explain. The truck wasn't random, it wasn't revenge in the dramatic sense. It was legal, procedural, and entirely justified. I'd filed a small claims case 2 weeks after returning home. I'd provided documentation, photos of my apartment before I left, receipts for the furniture they'd sold, testimony from neighbors who'd seen them loading things into trucks while I was abroad. I'd proven ownership, I'd proven theft. The court had ruled in my favor. The judgment allowed for asset recovery, meaning they owed me the value of what they'd taken, and if they couldn't pay, the court could authorize seizure of equivalent assets. They'd had 30 days to settle. They hadn't. They'd ignored the notices, assuming I'd let it go. So the court sent professionals to collect. My family didn't understand this at first. They thought I'd sent people to harass them. They thought it was personal, emotional, some kind of petty retaliation. It wasn't. It was just paperwork catching up to people who thought paperwork didn't apply to them. The messages kept coming. My brother demanded I call him. My sister sent paragraphs about how I was tearing the family apart. My mother left voicemails that started angry and ended desperate. I didn't answer. When I finally responded, 3 days later, my replies were short, factual, cold. "You sold my property without permission. I filed a legal claim. The court agreed. This is the outcome." My brother called me vindictive. My sister said I was being cruel over material things. My mother said I'd gone too far, that family didn't do this to each other. I replied once more, "You did this first. I just made it official." Then I stopped responding entirely. They tried calling from different numbers. They sent emails. My sister showed up at my apartment while I was still out of the country and left notes on my door. My mother contacted mutual friends, trying to get someone to talk sense into me. But there was nothing to talk about. I hadn't acted out of rage. I hadn't screamed or threatened or made dramatic declarations. I'd simply used the systems available to me. The same systems they'd assumed I was too passive, too forgiving, too well-trained to ever use. They were scrambling now, blaming each other. My sister said my brother had pushed her to sell more than she wanted. My brother said my mother had suggested it first. My mother said they'd all agreed it was fine. None of them said they were sorry. They just wanted me to undo what they couldn't undo themselves. But I was thousands of miles away, and I had no intention of saving them from the consequences of their own choices. I came back 2 weeks later. My mother called the day I landed. I let it go to voicemail. She said we needed to talk, that things had gotten out of hand, that we were still family. I didn't call back. My sister texted asking if we could meet for coffee. I replied 2 days later, "I'm busy right now." My brother sent an email, long, winding, half apology and half justification. He said he understood why I was upset, but that I'd taken things too far. He said he hoped we could move past this. I archived it without responding. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic confrontations, no tearful reconciliations or final declarations of estrangement. I just stepped back. When my mother called, I didn't answer. When my sister invited me to family dinners, I said I had plans. When my brother asked if I was still angry, I said I was fine, which was true, and also not an invitation to continue the conversation. They interpreted my politeness as potential. They thought if they waited long enough, I'd soften. They thought distance was temporary. It wasn't. I started rebuilding. New furniture, chosen carefully. A couch that was just mine. a desk I assembled without anyone's help. I didn't replace my grandmother's chair, nothing could replace that, but I found a new one that felt like a beginning instead of a loss. I went to work, I saw friends, I lived my life without updating my family on any of it. And the strangest thing happened. I didn't miss them. Not the way I thought I would, not the way I'd been trained to believe I should. What I'd lost wasn't just furniture. It was the belief that family meant safety, the idea that blood made people trustworthy, the illusion that love was enough to prevent harm. Those things were gone, and I couldn't get them back. But I also didn't have to keep pretending they existed. I stopped performing closeness, stopped forcing warmth I didn't feel, stopped answering calls out of obligation. And the relief, quiet, unexpected, was almost disorienting. I'd spent years believing that cutting off family required some dramatic breaking point, some unforgivable act. But it didn't. It just required stopping. Stopping the effort, stopping the forgiveness, stopping the belief that they'd ever see me as anything more than someone whose boundaries didn't matter. So I stopped, and my life, for the first time in years, felt like it belonged to me. It's been a year now. My apartment looks different than it did before. Not worse, not better, just different. The couch is new, deep blue instead of gray. The bookshelf is sleek and modern, nothing like the one my father built, but it holds my books the same way. The lamp on my desk is simple, functional, chosen because I liked it, not because it marked any particular milestone. I don't think about what used to be here anymore. Not often, anyway. Sometimes I'll remember my grandmother's chair and feel the loss like a quick, sharp ache, but it doesn't linger the way it used to. It's just a fact now, something that happened, something I survived. I learned things I didn't want to learn. I learned that some people will take from you if you let them, that they'll justify it, minimize it, reframe it as love or necessity or something you should have seen coming. I learned that confrontation doesn't always lead to accountability, that apologies don't always mean change. I learned that silence can be the loudest response you give, not the silence of suppression or fear, but the silence of refusal, the kind that says, I don't owe you my presence, I don't owe you my forgiveness, I don't owe you the performance of family when you've proven what that word means to you. I learned that distance isn't cruelty, it's self-preservation. My family still reaches out occasionally, a text on my birthday, an invitation to Thanksgiving. My mother sometimes leaves voicemails saying she misses me, that she hopes we can talk soon. I don't respond with anger. I don't respond at all, because there's nothing left to say. They didn't just take my furniture. They took the version of me that believed family was safe, and I can't get that back. I'm not sure I'd want to. This version, the one sitting here now in an apartment I rebuilt on my terms, is quieter, more careful, less forgiving, but also, finally, at peace. I don't feel victorious. I don't feel vindicated. I don't feel like I won anything. I just feel free. Free from the weight of pretending, free from the exhaustion of explaining, free from the belief that love requires letting people hurt you. I look around my apartment, my space, my choices, my boundaries, and I feel nothing toward them. Not anger, not sadness, just quiet. And that, more than anything, feels like coming home.